Ethan loved the new apartment he had moved into. He had been searching for a place of his own for a long time, and this was exactly what he had dreamed of. It was in a quiet neighborhood. The neighbors rarely showed themselves, and the building had a modern design. However, he had never seen the person living in the apartment next to his. The building manager told him that an old woman lived there, but she never spoke to anyone. For the first few weeks, Ethan didn't think much of it. But at night, he started hearing strange sounds coming from the woman's apartment. Sometimes it was a faint whisper, other times a deep, muffled groan. At first, he assumed it was the television, but the irregularity of the sounds began to unsettle him. Every time he approached the door, the apartment would fall into complete silence. One night, Ethan noticed that a letter had been mistakenly placed in the old woman's mailbox. He opened the box and took the envelope. There was no name or address on it, just a single sentence written in trembling handwriting. "Do not open the door." What did this message mean? Curiosity slowly consumed Ethan. Every time he passed by the woman's apartment, he heard a faint rustling from inside. Maybe she needed help? A few days later, when he heard the whispers again around midnight, he knocked on her door. There was no response, but he thought he heard the sound of a chair moving inside. It was as if someone was shifting in the dark. The next day, he asked an elderly neighbor in the building about the woman. The answer sent chills down his spine. "Oh, that apartment? That place has been empty for years. The old woman died 5 years ago. No one lives there." Ethan shook his head, thinking he had misunderstood. But the old neighbor was serious. That night, Ethan couldn't resist and stood in front of the woman's apartment door. He noticed a faint light glowing from underneath. Maybe a homeless person had taken shelter there. He felt a creeping fear, but his curiosity won out. He slowly pushed the door. It was unlocked. Stepping inside, he took a cautious breath. The apartment was dark, and everything was covered in dust as if untouched for years. But the most disturbing thing was the walls. They were covered in photographs. As Ethan approached, his skin crawled. Every single photo was of him. Pictures of him at the building entrance, on the staircase, even one taken through his bedroom window the night before. He took a deep breath, wanting to turn back, but the door suddenly slammed shut on its own. He felt something shift in the room. It was as if a presence was breathing down his neck. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. Suddenly, a low whisper echoed, "Ethan, now you're here too." The voice reverberated from every direction. He desperately tried to open the door, but his body was paralyzed. The figure stepped closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frozen in place, Ethan's vision darkened. The last thing he saw was a pair of empty, soulless eyes staring back at him. The next morning, no one in the building saw Ethan again. But a few days later, the old neighbor noticed a new letter had been slipped under the door of the empty apartment. Written in the same trembling handwriting were the words, "Do not open the door." Sophie and her husband Daniel had finally rented their dream apartment. It was a bit far from the city center, but the building was quiet and peaceful. The only issue was that the upper floors were a little old. The landlord had mentioned that an elderly man lived alone on the top floor. "He's been there for years, not much of a talker," he had said with a shrug. Sophie wasn't too concerned. After all, having a neighbor upstairs might make them feel less alone. The first few weeks were quiet. Sophie enjoyed looking out the window while settling into their home. At sunset, the sky lit up in hues of orange and purple, and a deep silence settled over the building. But one night, just as she was about to fall asleep, she heard a faint creak from the ceiling. At first, she thought it was the wind, but when she heard the same sounds again a few nights later, she grew uneasy. Heavy footsteps sometimes echoed directly above them. When she mentioned it to Daniel, he just laughed. "The old man must be taking a late-night walk," he said, shrugging it off. But Sophie's unease didn't fade. One morning, while chatting with a neighbor, the conversation turned to the old man upstairs. "The man upstairs?" the woman asked, furrowing her brow. "That apartment has been empty for 5 years. The last tenant moved out suddenly, and no one has lived there since." A chill ran down Sophie's spine. The footsteps she had heard played over and over in her mind. She was certain someone lived there. But if no one was there, then who had she been hearing? That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. Daniel had already drifted off, but she lay staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound. Around 3 a.m., she heard a creak from the attic, followed by slow, heavy footsteps. The sound stopped directly above their bed. Sophie took a deep breath. At that moment, she noticed something sliding under the door. Her heart pounded. With trembling hands, she picked it up. A photograph. An old, faded photograph. There was only a single date written on the back, 2002. When Sophie turned it over, her breath caught in her throat. In the picture, she and Daniel were sleeping in their bed. But that was impossible. Sophie had a terrible feeling that the photo had been taken just 10 minutes ago. As the picture slipped from her fingers, the footsteps above started again. But this time, they were clearer. They were moving, coming closer. It sounded like they were heading down, toward their door. The footsteps stopped just outside. Sophie, paralyzed with fear, shook Daniel, trying to wake him, but he was in a deep sleep. Then she saw it. A thin, elongated shadow slowly slid under the door. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then the doorknob moved, just slightly. Someone was trying to open the door. Sophie sat frozen, unable to move. Then, all at once, everything went silent. Minutes passed. She didn't dare open the door. The only sound in the room was her own ragged breathing. In the morning, she told Daniel about the terrifying night. He suggested it might have been a sleep-deprived hallucination. But Sophie knew what she had experienced was real. In the daylight, when she checked the floor in front of the door, her blood ran cold. Long, claw-like scratches marred the wooden surface. That day, they called the police. The officers broke into the upstairs apartment to investigate, but inside, it was completely empty. Dust covered everything, as if no one had stepped inside for years. The rooms were silent. The only strange thing was a small, hollow space beneath the floorboards, directly above Sophie and Daniel's bedroom, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. From that night on, Sophie heard the footsteps every single night. Daniel didn't seem to notice, but Sophie lay awake, listening. The steps were slower now, more deliberate, as if waiting, as if watching. And the most horrifying thing of all? Every morning, Sophie woke up to find another photograph slipped under the door. At first, they were old pictures, but with each passing night, the photos became more recent, until the last one stopped her heart. This time, it was her own hand, reaching for the doorknob. Due to his job, Jake constantly moved from city to city. Instead of settling down, he preferred short-term rentals, and the latest apartment he rented was the most spacious and modern he had ever stayed in. However, from the very first day, the man in the apartment across from him gave him an unsettling feeling. The man stood by the window at all hours, staring outside. Whether Jake was leaving for work in the morning, having his afternoon coffee, or waking up in the middle of the night, he was always there. At first, Jake thought the man was just old and lonely, maybe just passing the time. But what caught his attention was that sometimes the man seemed to be looking directly at him. Whenever Jake stepped onto his balcony, he noticed the man peering through the curtains as if fixated on him. He tried to ignore it at first, but every time their eyes met, an unexplainable unease filled him. One night, as he returned from the store, he walked through the empty, silent hallway of the apartment building. Just as he was about to unlock his door, he heard a faint rustling sound from the opposite apartment. Was someone inside? He had never seen anyone enter or leave that unit. As he looked down while opening his door, he noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper on the floor. Picking it up, he saw that it contained only 3 words. "You're sleeping in the wrong place." Jake thought it was a bad joke. Maybe it was a forgotten note from the previous tenant or a childish prank. He crumpled it and tossed it in the trash, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, as he lay in bed, he glanced one last time at the apartment across. The man was still there, standing by the window as usual, unmoving, staring straight into Jake's room. Days passed, but Jake's discomfort only grew. One evening after coming home from work, he took off his coat and immediately sensed that something felt off. Everything seemed in its place, but the air in the room was different. When he went to the kitchen for water, his eyes landed on his knife set. One knife was missing. He told himself he must have moved it, but no matter how hard he searched, he couldn't find it. That night, his sleep was suddenly interrupted. He heard the faint creak of his bedroom door. His eyelids were heavy, but he could feel someone inside the room. Holding his breath, he slowly opened his eyes and saw a silhouette leaning over the edge of his bed. He could hear its breathing. Fear paralyzed him. One thought echoed in his mind. Did I forget to lock the door? Jake fought the urge to scream. He held his breath and squeezed his eyes shut. For several seconds, he didn't move a muscle. Finally, gathering his courage, he reopened his eyes. The figure at the edge of his bed was gone, but when he looked toward the window, his heart stopped. The man in the opposite apartment was still there, staring. If he was at his window, then who had been standing beside his bed? At dawn, Jake decided to leave the apartment immediately. He no longer felt safe. As he hurriedly packed his belongings, something fell from his pocket. A small metallic key. It wasn't his. With trembling hands, he examined it. One word was engraved on it. Enter. Jake's heart pounded violently. As he looked up, he noticed that the door to the opposite apartment was slightly open. It was always supposed to be locked. From inside, a low voice echoed through the empty hallway. Jake, come inside. The whisper carried something sinister. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed to be reaching for him. Jake took a step back. His instincts screamed for him to run, but something held him in place. Taking a deep breath, he glanced one last time at the apartment window across. But the man was gone. For the first time, the window was empty. A dry lump formed in Jake's throat. His instincts begged him to leave. Yet somehow, his feet carried him forward. As he stared at the key in his palm, he saw the door creak open on its own. The whispers inside kept calling his name. Jake, come inside. His skin prickled with fear. He stepped closer to see if anyone was inside, but at that moment, he felt warm breath on the back of his neck. He spun around instantly. The hallway was empty. His heart was pounding. He wanted to run, but something stopped him. In front of him was himself. A perfect copy of Jake stood there, staring with a pale smile. In a distorted, hushed voice, it whispered, "You're sleeping in the wrong place." Jake wanted to scream, but no sound came out. As darkness clouded his vision, he felt himself falling into an endless void while his double took his place. The next morning, there was someone standing by the window of the opposite apartment. It was Jake, but it wasn't really him anymore. A new tenant was already on the way.